Hey everybody, my name is Rima McCoy McDeed. My pronouns are she and her, and I want to talk about white supremacy from a vantage point that I think we don't talk about it enough from in our society. And that's from the vantage point of marginalized communities. So queer community, women, disability community, et cetera, et cetera. Hotbeds of white supremacy, which is funny because nobody in any of these communities wants to admit that they are racist or anti-Black. And yet racism and anti-Blackness really truly abound in all of these spaces in ways that we don't typically necessarily associate with white supremacy. And I think that all things considered, it's time for us as a society to start having conversations about what's going on with white supremacy in marginalized communities. Because my argument is that white supremacy is using marginalized communities and also progressive spaces, academic spaces, any spaces where people identify with being woke as incubators, a space to evolve and mutate and ensure its sustainability. And so because of that, I think it's time that we shift our conversations regarding white supremacy from the more bombastic manifestations to the more subtle. And so I'm asking for between 10 and 15 minutes of your time today, and want to share a handy dandy slideshow with everybody. And the title of my slideshow is Where's Whiteness? And for those of you listening along, got a picture of Where's Waldo here, superimposed over a map of some unidentified location. Where's Whiteness? All right. I want to talk about how white supremacy, again, is using marginalized and also progressive, academic, liberal, other woke spaces to mutate, evolve, and ensure its sustainability in our seemingly, quote unquote, changing society. So a few caveats. I am not an academic, and I'm not particularly well read as far as books on anti-racism or anything along those lines is concerned. My experience is of the on-the-ground varietal, observing anti-Blackness in marginalized spaces, and of course, experiencing it myself. The views and opinions I express in this video are mine and mine alone. I cannot emphasize that enough. This is me using my space to articulate my opinions. And this presentation is basically a glorified social media post. In fact, it's going to land on social media as soon as it is recorded and captioned. This is not a scholarly analysis, okay? So who am I? Again, my name's Rima McCoy McDeed, she, her pronouns. I'll do a visual description of myself. I am Black woman, early 40s, natural brown hair, tortoiseshell glasses. I am seated in my home office with various pieces of artwork behind me. I am the first Black executive director of a national disability-led nonprofit organization. I also facilitate trainings on how anti-Blackness manifests in disability spaces and other spaces as well. I am the first openly autistic person to run for state legislature in US history. I did not win anyhow. Again, I cannot emphasize enough that the views and opinions that I am expressing during this video are mine and mine alone. For those of you listening along, I've got a picture up of me in 1989. I'm 9 years old here, and I have an Afro mullet. I have this picture up because I want to make it clear, and it should be obvious to anybody that is looking at this photograph or of me today. I do have a white parent. I'm a Black person with a white parent. And those of you who are especially proficient in Black biracial children can look at this Afro mullet that I have on my head, and it clearly indicates that the white parent that I have is a white mother. So that's nightmare haircut, 1989. I have this picture here, though, because although I am speaking about anti-Blackness, and I am a Black person myself, I think that it behooves Black biracial folks like myself to affirm and acknowledge the fact that because we bring whiteness with us wherever we go, as even though we are Black people, when we are in Black spaces, we bring whiteness with us and invariably render those spaces unsafe. It's something that we need to acknowledge and affirm and not be offended when it's brought to our attention. Anyhow, topic at hand today. So when we think about white supremacy, typically we think an overtly single race society, and that single race being white people. I would like for us to think about white supremacy differently today. I would like to think about it in its more subtle context, a covertly single race society. And so a covertly single race society allows for diversity, allows for a cornucopia of different colors of people to mill about, but ultimately the decision makers in a covertly single race society belong to a single race, and in the society that we live in, that's the white race. And so a covertly single race society is a society dominated by the decision makers who are white people, and it's white people that are setting the status quo. And that's the white supremacy that manifests in marginalized communities all over the place. So let's talk about that in very specific context. So overt manifestations of white supremacy. These are when 99.44% of us see this stuff, we all agree, no matter what political affiliation we are, what color skin we have, whatever, we all agree this is white supremacist stuff. So KKK burning a cross in a Black person's front yard, calling a Black person the N-word, racial profiling, redlining in a community. Everybody knows this stuff overtly white supremacist. Covert manifestations of white supremacy and what these look like in marginalized communities. So just think about a marginalized community. Maybe you yourself participate in a marginalized community. This is what covert white supremacy looks like in a marginalized community that is inclusive of white people. The prevalence of white people as decision makers in that space, and therefore they are at the helm of setting the status quo for that space. Engaging in quote unquote outreach to racially marginalized people after the fact, after the initiative has been created, instead of ensuring that racially marginalized people are playing decision-making roles in the devising of the initiative in the first place. White members of a marginalized group using that proximity to marginalization to center themselves in conversations with Black people. Not only center, but override feedback from Black people about our experiences of being marginalized. Either feigning confusion, becoming impatient, or getting starry-eyed and wanting to put on pedestal a Black woman when she's speaking with authority in a manner that disrupts that status quo. You know, that status quo that is the foundation of a covertly white supremacist space. Asserting that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is a hero for disabled people, or that Walt Whitman is a hero for queer people, or that Alyssa Milano is a hero for women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for those of you who are thinking, well, I can't benefit from white supremacy because I'm disabled, or I grew up poor, or I'm queer, or I'm aging, I'm fat, I'm a religious minority, I'm trans, I'm whatever marginalized identity you can throw out in front of yourself to shield yourself from admitting that you benefit from white supremacy if you're a white person. So that's not true. White people benefit from white supremacy in spite of being marginalized person, could even be a multiply marginalized person. And in fact, that the very fact that white people who are marginalized in some capacity forget that Black people can also be disabled or poor or queer or a woman or fat or a religious minority, whatever, is in and of itself a manifestation of white supremacy, because that reveals that subconsciously white people are bopping around thinking that they're the default setting for whatever marginalized community they participate in. So I don't want white people to think that you know, I'm turning up the flames on just them. This conversation is not just inclusive of white people. Racially and ethnically marginalized people who are not Black, and racially marginalized Black people like myself, we aren't off the hook here. So there's something called colorism. And for those of you listening along, I've got a picture here from MTV Decoded, and it's a picture from their feature on Latino colorism. Up next, I've got a picture here that has the title Colorism in Asia, along with two pictures of young children who are Asian, but of a variety of skin tones, some light, some dark, some in between. And then I've got for those of you listening along, I've got an article here that references colorism in the Jewish community. And so I'm bringing colorism into the mix because it's this is yet another space where white supremacy subtly manifests. You know, anti-Blackness is really a global phenomenon. A anti-dark skin is unfortunately a part of human history, and historically, white light skin has been associated with power and success, and dark skin with well, the opposite. In fact, in communities comprised of racially and ethnically marginalized people, white and light skin has historically indicated a livelihood that's not contingent on toiling outdoors, but rather enjoying the fruits of dark complected people's labor that is typically stigmatized by those who benefit from it. That's messed up. In marginalized communities that are inclusive of white people in the United States and beyond, white people most closely physically resemble those that have the ability to extend or withhold rights to said community, typically are the first ones to benefit from the rights when they're extended. And if and when those rights are bestowed to that marginalized community, after the white people get first dibs, then it's non-Black racially marginalized people and ambiguously Black people like myself. And then unambiguously Black people, Black women in particular, have become incredibly proficient in creating mutual aid paradigms and other means and mechanisms to bridge the gap, so to speak, with regards to the barriers to benefiting from whatever rights have been extended to whatever marginalized group that they participate in. And so because covert white supremacy has done such a great job of quietly evolving while diverting attention to its overt manifestation, I have reached a point where I'm reticent to use the term white supremacy. Frankly, I also am reticent to use words like racism or anti-racism or bigotry, because white supremacy is just getting really good at hiding in all of these spaces. And along with it, anti-Blackness. And so I am shifting. I still use the term white supremacy, but I am actively shifting to discontinuing using that word and shifting into using the word whiteness. And white supremacy is perceived typically like a scar or an open wound. It's something everybody can see, like, whoa, that is a bloody mess over there. There's no denying that that is a mess. In fact, the white supremacy, the whiteness that I'm talking about today doesn't look like that. And so because it doesn't look like that, it's historically been very difficult to talk about it, because it's sort of like a parasite hanging out internally, and it's invisible, but nevertheless ever present, and it's destructive. And so the opposite of whiteness, for the purposes of this conversation, purposes of how I'm using the term whiteness, is not blackness, not at all. It's anti-blackness. And wherever there is whiteness, there is anti-blackness. Lots of marginalized communities, there's whiteness, whiteness abounds. And with that is anti-blackness. And so, who gets left behind when a marginalized group that's inclusive of white people is fighting for its rights? So, the caveat of rights is that rights are all about kind of like outreach, all about creating space for people in a society that wasn't intended to contain them in the first place, or at least contain them with a level of equity as everybody else. And so if and when rights are bestowed to a marginalized community, it's the most privileged of that marginalized community that benefit. And, more often than not, unfortunately, what history has shown us is that those benefits are used by the most privileged in a marginalized community to assume the role of powers that be in their respective community, thus creating a parallel society to the mainstream. This is why if you look in queer spaces or in women's spaces or disability space, where I spend a lot of time, decision makers by and large are white. If you see racially marginalized folks, Black folks in particular, operating in any kind of leadership capacity, more often than not, they're doing so at the discretion of the white decision makers. This is a big reason why when you get into marginalized spaces that are inclusive of white people, when you see racially marginalized Black people in particular in leadership roles, more often than not, they are folks that have a proven track record of not rocking the boat, not questioning the status quo, and of being grateful to have the opportunity to be in a leadership position. This is why disability, queer, trans, women, other spaces are hotbeds of white supremacy or whiteness. But again, because it doesn't manifest like a cross burning or George Floyd being murdered on Facebook Live or anything along those lines, it is difficult to meaningfully engage white, also non-Black people of color and ambiguously Black people in meaningful conversations about the systemic implications. And that's how whiteness, white supremacy, is using marginalized spaces to proliferate, to reinvent itself, and to create a new version of itself that will perhaps outlive us all. And so given all of that, so for those of you listening along, I've got a picture here. The first picture in this slideshow had one Where's Waldo. This one has a bunch of Where's Waldos, and they are dancing on a giant white male figure. So given all of what I've just articulated, how do marginalized communities address how whiteness / white supremacy is using these spaces to evolve itself and ensure its sustainability as we all self-identify as woke, those of us in marginalized spaces, academic spaces, quote unquote, progressive spaces, who swear up and down that we're woke and the anti-Blackness is just all around us, hidden in plain sight. We refuse to talk about it. And when somebody like me breaches the subject, we do absolutely everything that we can to shut them the hell up. That is where I'm going to leave us here for now. And that is where I will pick up this conversation in my next video. I thank you all for your time. And I encourage you to do some thinking about how whiteness is pervading whatever space it is that you're inhabiting. Again, it's not always going to be a cross burning, never going to, and not necessarily going to have a great big arrow pointing to it and saying, ha, this is white supremacy. Not anymore. As we continue to nosedive into the 21st century, white supremacy, whiteness is very smart and is doing absolutely everything that it can to sustain itself and ensure that it's here for the long haul. And so, you know, the days of, and we still have overt manifestations of white supremacy happening all over the place, but that will more than likely die away eventually. And it's the subtle manifestation that you know, instead of the bullet wound to the chest that is overt white supremacy, it'll be the death by 1,000 paper cuts manifestation of this modern whiteness that will do Black folks in. And so it's time to have this conversation. I encourage you, those of you who are interested in this conversation, to, at this point, do some internal investigation. And if you're interested in reading more about anti-Blackness, I encourage you to use Google, seek out unambiguously Black women who are doing this work, having these conversations, and support their efforts accordingly. With that, I will thank you all for your time today, and stay tuned for the next video.